Uh, yep. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, I think it's visible
Yes, it is.
so
Yeah.
far.
Okay. Yep. So yeah, just a preliminary side here. So a little bit about me. I think you guys already know a lot about me. So I have a background. Initially, I pursued my bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Pune University, and I think during my third year or around my second or third year, I sort of the first step into machine learning for me was looking at Andrew Ng's Stanford online course. So I think like that's a starting point for pretty much everyone who at least sort of transitions from a non-CS background into a little bit of the deep learning or the AI domain. So that really fascinated me, and I sort of wanted to learn more. And I did a few bit of projects here and there, and that's when I figured out that computer vision and robotics seems to be a very interesting area to get into. And that's how I sort of started looking into applying for my master's over here. And then yeah, I can surely get into the details more as we go ahead. So I've prepared slides which are a little light-hearted as well, so I'll be having images and memes all around the slides as well, so you have a good time while reading the stuff. So I can give you like a brief summary of what research areas are in WPI. So the first one is like humanoid robotics, where we have the Atlas, which is in a World Lab. So humanoid robotics is basically dealing with legged robotics and robots which have hands as well. So how do you deal with locomotion, learning, localization? So it deals with a lot of aspects, and interesting projects which are going on in WPI related to humanoid robotics can be categorized as, so there's something called shadow motion, where you sort of have a robot doing some action, and sorry, you have a human doing an action and a robot is actually imitating the exact action. So it's not as simple as it sounds, obviously. So that's an interesting research area which is being taken up in WPI. So other areas include soft robots. Soft robots are, generally speaking, they are closely associated with medical robotics, as in they deal with some aspects where you supposing have an endoscope surgery or something like that, and you have a robot which is actually being put down your throat to sort of look into your insides and come up with some problems. So that's not something I've personally dealt with a lot, so I've not got a very good idea. And swarm intelligence is a pretty interesting concept as well. So if you have to achieve a certain task and you have multiple robots, so how do you sort of decentralize your algorithm so that all of them can work together and get you some interesting results? So that is a research area which is pretty prominent at WP, and we've got an amazing faculty member here called Carlo Pinceroli, who's one of the founding fathers of this field. So it's very interesting and fascinating in general, and his lab is doing pretty good work as well. Another important research area for WPI is surgical and medical robotics. So we have like I think 4 or 5 labs related to surgical or medical robotics in some way or the other. And we even have a new center called Practice Point, which has opened up, and it's entirely related to imaging and medical robotics, particularly MRI, ultrasound, photoacoustic imaging, a lot of things. And you have more other generic areas as well, like human robot interaction, manipulation. And I'll get into details for these areas as soon as we move ahead. And if you find them relevant or if you have any questions, you can surely ask me. I can sort of tell you how much ever I know. But yeah, these are like the sort of research areas in general in robotics, and we do have labs in WPI here as well related to the same. So yeah, let's get started about, I'm not sure how many of you might actually be considering pursuing an MS over here. So in WPI in general, or even in the States or any other place, if you are considering an MS, I believe it's certainly a big investment, and you should be very careful when you're selecting your college, your branch, and all those things. So the first piece of advice I think is the most important one over here is prioritize your program and the branch. And it sort of explains itself by looking at the second point. It's like having a robotics track under the mechanical department is not the same as MS in robotics. So people who want to get into full-fledged robotics versus people who transition from the mechanical track or maybe a EC track or maybe a CS track into robotics, it's going to be different for all of them. And the major reason why this happens is because you have credit limitations on what you can do. So at WPI, like we have an example of 30 credits are needed for graduating. So what happens over here is that you have to take like 15 core robotics credits, and then you have to do some like minimum 3 credits research, and you have 3 credits more for a business course. So like 21 credits are already consumed that way. So you have 9 credits remaining out of your entire credits for actually picking a course which might not be in your department. So say from the CS department, you found deep learning pretty interesting, or reinforcement learning, or from the ECE department, you found machine learning for embedded systems. So any interesting course which you might want to take, if you are not on the right track for your MS, you won't be able to take that course. So you don't want that to happen. Make sure you research that correctly. Like you go through the credit and course requirements for your program of interest. And yeah, location is important, but it is not everything. So I'm trying to emphasize this point as well, because you would hear many people telling you, okay, California is a pretty good place, as in there's so many startups. You've got Silicon Valley over there, and then New York on the East Coast and Boston. Like, these are the hot places. So yeah, certainly the East Coast and West Coast in general are pretty good places to be, at least in the US. But initially, when you'll be applying for internships and for jobs and for anything, they're going to ask you if you're going to be open for relocation. And until and unless you don't have a job, you are going to be open for relocation. So you're going to be probably moving to anywhere you get an internship or job to, at least for that temporary phase. So don't worry too much about location. And labs. So I think you guys are already into a lot of research, at least way more than what I was into back at my time. So make sure you find labs which have interesting work going on. And I sort of emphasize interesting because obviously everyone is going to select a different track. So make sure that you have interests which align with those research interests of the professors who are working in those labs, because that's pretty influential on how your master sort of goes ahead. So before coming, yeah, I think these are questions. I keep getting these questions on LinkedIn. I still get them even today. Like you get juniors asking me, how do I sort of finalize these universities? What are the things I should work on before coming? I have an interest in deep learning. I'm from a mechanical background. Can I sort of transition into that phase? So I think robotics in general is the best branch if you are considering to switch from those areas. So supposing you are from one of those areas, like not CS or EC, maybe you could be an industrial guy, a production guy, or mech guy, a mining guy. So someone who's formally not taken up a lot of CS related courses in their undergrad, but finds AI very interesting in general, has one of the best chances over here in robotics to transition into that area. So a few things which these weren't told to me by my seniors, so I sort of figured them out after coming over here. But these are really important according to me. So everyone over here, at least like 95% of the robotics companies are focused on C++. So I know Python is like, okay, yeah, Python is pseudocode is directly transferable into Python. So you say, okay, it's pretty easy to use Python. But yeah, C++ is very important for robotics people. Like most of the companies you'll be looking at, they'll be having their initial interview rounds, or even the take-home coding test or anything like that, even the live coding rounds, it's going to be C++ probably, at least in the initial stages. They would give you an option for Python, but that really depends from company to company. And selecting an area of specialization is very important as well, because it's not hard and fast. I think this is the most lax out of all these things which you should do. You should be doing before coming. But selecting an area of specialization gives you a very big head start over the other candidates who are going to come in with an MS for you, because you're going to be applying for jobs together at the end of the day, and any head start you have will surely prove to be a lot of difference as you move forward. So it could be anything, like you would be wanting computer vision, or maybe you're looking into SLAM or deep learning, or you're into the motion planning and controls aspect, or you're interested in dynamics and controls as well, or even a more niche area like manipulation or legged locomotion, like some people described earlier. So selecting an area of specialization and then sort of tailoring your coursework as you go along the way is going to be very important. It's like one of the most important aspects before coming, which you can actually look into and which will make a lot of difference. And yeah, networking is very important over here. That's something I had no clue in India back then, that okay, why is networking so important? But over here, referrals and internally knowing a lot of people into the company, or having a lot of contact with seniors and generally people in your area, is going to be very helpful for you. You're going to get access to jobs which are usually not even posted on the job portals, and you'll be like, you might see a friend who just got into who got an internship at some place, and you're like, dude, I look at this company every day, I didn't even see a posting. He's like, yeah, I had a friend. So you won't even come to know. And I'm not sure if you started working in LaTeX, but having a resume draft initially prepared in LaTeX would be nice as well, because you'll sort of get used to it once you start writing reports over here for your projects, and you would even be drafting your resume in LaTeX. So these are the things I think which can prove to be pretty important when you sort of think about pursuing an MS, and make sure that these are the skills you sort of brush on, so that once you come here, you're not sort of confused. Because there are a lot of people who come here and specialize afterwards, as in they take up motion planning related courses, they'll take up deep learning, they'll take up reinforcement learning. Controls dynamics are usually mandatory. So you take up these courses and then you sort of try and find your way. I don't have anything against that personally. It's just going to take a little bit more of time. And 2 years do fly by, believe me. Like we are in our last semesters right now. We don't know literally what's happened since the last 1 year. Like how did the time go quickly? But it does go quickly. So yep. I can take a pause over here in case anyone has any questions in particular related to before coming here, or how do you select a university, or any sort of nagging things which might be on your mind. Like, so it's open for questions at the moment before I sort of transition into my personal experience and my research. So let me know if you have any questions.
Sure, I don't have anything as of now, but anyone, I think, if you have any question, you can go forward.
You can ask me about like university selection or like other countries as well. I have a little bit of idea about Germany, I think, but not too much. But anything in general about before coming here or selecting a university, now would be a good time to sort of get your doubts answered.
Okay, so I'll just take a quick question, possibly.
Sure.
I hope it's not
just sorry for cutting. Before you ask a question, I would really appreciate you saying your name, because I'm not very familiar with the Meets thing, and your name doesn't pop up. So yeah.
So I'm Lokesh, as I said. I started the session. Lokesh Krishna.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. Video is on. My bad.
Yeah, no issue. So the thing is, like a lot of us here aspire to get into robotics, but as you said, in India the exposure is very less, and we don't have any form of main track robotics jobs yet. So do you see like anything coming to India, or it's just that we people get to India and so get for out of India? So this is my first question. And my second question is, people are a little skeptical. So what will you tell to those people who are not confident on directly going away with a master? So they know they are interested in robotics, but still, given all the external influences or the situations. So what exactly did you keep in mind when you took the big step of, okay, I want to pursue my master's and this interested, and this is the future or something that I see, so I'm taking this step? What pushed you to do that?
Okay, I think the two questions are good, and they're sort of intertwined as well. So for your first question in particular, like, do you see a lot of these things coming into India? I think like that's a question which is on everybody's mind as well. So robotics grads in particular, you have like a few areas which you do transition into after your master's, considering you're opting for a job. So you do have the option of going into the self-driving companies. Like, they are students from our university who've at least interviewed at Tesla, Waymo, and Argo AI. So these are the prominent self-driving companies, and robotics and self-driving in general has a lot of cross functionality. So there's a lot of blend in the curriculum. So there are a lot of students who do apply for that domain. So that is one domain which I particularly am not very confident about India seeing it pretty soon. Like self-driving, I know there's a startup called Swayat Robotics who's working into at least deep learning based perception for robots in general, and they've got impressive results on Indian roads. But I think dealing with corner cases in the US, where you already have so much structure with the traffic, for example, you have lanes, you have everything which is very structured, and people don't usually break traffic rules over here. Like, the consequences are a lot more severe than what they are in India. So even in spite of having such a structured system, there are so many extreme edge cases which your perception module is dealing with, that you're still not able to come up with a full self-driving solution now. So level 5 is still a dream. Tesla may be pushing for it, but as far as I have heard, their initial software which they've also pushed out has not been that great. So level 5 is still quite far away in the US, and even when it does come into the US, transitioning into India, I have question marks about that. So that was answering like the autonomous side of it. But I think a few areas which I've seen personally in India have got a lot of scope is, one has been drone delivery and surveillance. Like, I've seen recently the government has given permission for that. So I guess the number of startups would be on the rise, which are sort of having deals with DRD or maybe ISRO, I don't know, like the firms which are actually there. So that may be an interesting avenue to pursue. And agricultural robotics is like what a lot of Indian students here are betting on, that there may be scope for in India. So there are startups which are coming up in that area as well. So I think at least at the bachelor stage, where you do not have a lot of exposure to the areas of robotics, not trying to focus on a particular application area, rather than that, build a skill set which could blend into a certain area. So that's what I'm going to be talking about towards towards the next part of my presentation, where in robotics you look into, like, you have various domains of expertise. You may be a perception engineer, you may be a SLAM engineer, you may be a motion planning controls engineer or dynamics engineer, or you may be a systems integrator. So you have multiple roles coming up, and irrespective of which area you go into, these roles are going to be there. So you may be working into maybe a robotic automation company which is working into factories, for example, using KUKA robots or FANUC robots for just assembly processes. So they are going to be having perception modules, planning modules, control modules, and the dynamics modules. So having a skill set where you can transition into any field in robotics in that sense would be really helpful. So you wouldn't need to worry too much about, okay, is this field going to be the future? You don't really need to worry about it. As long as robots are going to be there, your skill set is going to be of value. So at least at an initial stage, you need to have that sort of security, and I know people are worried about it. So I would suggest the same. And for the second part of your question, like how do you take the big step towards MS? I think if you think that, for me as a mechanical student, once I sort of had the AI kick, that I started training my own models, and I was like, okay, I couldn't see myself doing the same thing in India. So I did have a little bit of work experience, which was a little bit related towards project management, but I couldn't apply those skills in any way towards my current job. And I felt that I sort of, if I am interested in this area, I should at least take the chance and go ahead and pursue it, because you never know, as in everyone has a different sort of approach towards that. But take the jump if you are more than 50% convinced that you would sort of look at yourself in the future, like 5 or 10 years down the line. Would you picture yourself doing that same thing in India versus in US? If the answer to that question is pretty obvious, I think you should then prioritize accordingly. And in case you guys are worried about like the COVID situation, or like how are the job scenes doing over here, so it was brutal last year. I'll be honest with you. As soon as the batch which graduated last year, as in the 2020 batch, they struggled initially. But as far as I know, almost all WPI seniors have gotten jobs which they're happy with. And I can say happy personally because I'm in contact with the seniors. So it's not like just something which was thrown at you and you're like, okay, I don't have an option, I need to do it. So that's pretty good. And for our batch, I can take another alternative view. Like, at least in my friend circle, I know everyone is doing very well. People have gotten good internships even this year, and they've already started getting full-time offers as well. So the economy is recovering, and I believe robotics is like one of these areas where you'll see the recovery the most soonest. So if you're having, and that's a testament, because so many students have joined in the spring semester. Like, you would be wondering, after this COVID situation, there would be a drop in numbers, but that has not been the case. So there are many students who've joined. I think the debate whether it makes sense to actually come when you don't have in-person classes is a valid debate, but in general, considering pursuing an MS at this time as well would be a decent idea according to me. As long as you have your priorities fixed and you sort of know which area you're getting into, you should be good. There are jobs opening up every day. So do you want me to continue with my presentation, or are there any more questions? Did I answer your questions, or like, do you have any follow-up things?
Yeah, it is. Thanks a lot for that question. It was pretty detailed. And I don't have more questions in this regard now.
Okay, then yeah, I can continue a little bit with my presentation. I have a few more slides about my projects and my research. So yeah. Oops, just a sec. Yep. So can you guys see my screen? I'll continue.
Yeah, I think it's visible.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, great. So I can talk about a little bit of my experience so far. So like I told you guys, I was sort of interested in machine learning and deep learning off the bat. Once I came into WPI, I sort of had at least a vague picture, okay, that these are the things I'm interested in. I'm not sure maybe if they would translate into a job from robotics or not, but I knew there were hot fields in general as well, and they seemed to be very interesting. So I sort of went with it. I said, let me see Like I'll take up courses and do interesting projects and see how it goes. So in my first semester, I did take up machine learning, which was a CSE course, but because of the flexibility WPI gives you in selecting courses from outside your department, I could take up machine learning and deep learning and subsequently other courses. So I think one of the best advantages that WPI personally has given me is the project-based experience. So like all the courses in WPI mandatorily have a project associated with the course. And that may sound, I don't know, like initially when you think of it, like why would you need a project with your course? But these are the best sort of highlights on your resume, like when you do a project related to the course, because over here, at least in the US in general, they believe a lot in hands-on learning. So even like your coursework balance would be like 70% or 60% of the coursework, the assignments, maybe the exams or any readings or presentations. And the remaining 30 to 40% is your project. And the way you can make the most out of your project personally is when you select a topic which is a little outside your comfort zone so that you get to learn a lot more. And in general, having the right attitude is the most important thing you can have over here. If you think it is too difficult or you think things are getting overwhelming, relax. It's the same for all master students when they come here, because you're literally being bombarded with a lot of more information than you ever seen. You go into the labs, you look at the labs, there are 20 labs doing some research, and you think, oh, all of this seems so amazing. I'm not able to decide what is going on. How can I take a decision? Because it's in general, robotics is vast, and WPI has a program which has been running since a lot of time. So in general, I say not even WPI, but any university you select, try and do projects which would highlight certain aspects of your resume outside your coursework. And these are the only things which your interviews actually sort of call you for interviews or even have conversations with you on initially. So supposing you have a first technical round, which is not coding, so it's going to be entirely resume based. And they're obviously going to see something in your resume. That's why they're going to call you for an interview. So make sure you do good projects which sound interesting as well and are interesting for you to work on. And going outside your comfort zone is rewarded over here. So don't worry in case you think that I don't know all the things from the start. It's a part of how master's life goes. Yep. So some projects and research, I think I'm going to describe like 4 or 5 projects. It's going to be a cursory sort of a view. I've just provided like the title and a few images. I can explain in a little detail what is going on, and you can feel free to ask me in case you have any more questions. So this was like one of my first projects at WPI. It was for a computer vision course, and we were working on street sign detection and road classification. So road sign classification. So what we were doing over here is you have a person with a simple mobile phone or a camera, and he is walking around a street in New York. And at that time, even at this time, like delivery robots are particularly still in the hype, at least in the US. So there are many startups, and even Amazon Robotics and Staples and other startups are working on delivery robots. So they don't want a person to actually go down to your house address and actually deliver something to you. So they have bots for that. And delivery bots deal with a lot of uncertainty in GPS. Because of a place like New York, because of the skyscrapers, there are certain effects which are called the canyon effects, where you're not able to triangulate your position very accurately. So we thought having an idea about your street sign and the road signs around you is going to be an interesting thing for a robot to have, and it's going to be helpful. So it was a mix of image processing and deep learning, and they were a little independent from their side. So towards the left, you can see that you have an image in New York where you can see the color image, and towards the right, we've actually thresholded a certain part of the image in such a way that you can only find the road sign which is being highlighted, which is called the West Side Highway. So in this approach, we couldn't traditionally go with the RGB color space. So we sort of transferred into the HSV, the hue, saturation, luminance, HSL or HSV color space, and we formulated a problem from there. So it was a first experience, like even for a project, you need to learn about you need to read about research papers and then sort of get started with it. So we applied a thresholding algorithm, adaptive thresholding algorithm in the HSL color space. And then we collected a bunch of road signs as well to train a CNN, a basic CNN to perform classification. So this was a little bit about our project from there. So we were achieving real-time results, like you move your camera around in the street and it will segment out the street signs for you, and it's going to classify road signs which it sees as well. So I'll like go through 2-3 projects at one time, and then I'll take a stop and then let you ask any questions in case you have any. So this was one of the first projects, and yeah, this was my project for machine learning as well. Looking back, it was a pretty simple project, I think, but we learned a lot. We sort of understood the difference between actually transitioning from machine learning to deep learning, and why do you need that transition. So our entire focus, as in I worked with 2 people during these projects who were with me for my computer vision and machine learning project, and our focus was entirely on computer vision based deep learning or machine learning. So over here, there was a Kaggle competition in 2016 or 17, I think, which was dealing with distracted driver activity recognition. So it's giving you like 10 classes over here, out of which one is safe driving. You can see on the image on the top, and all the other classes are dealing with distracted driving, like you're texting or you're calling or you're reaching behind or talking to a passenger or whatever. So your task was basically to just given an image, classify whether this is distracted driving, and then identify which class it belongs to. So I think everyone initially would think, okay, this is like the ideal use case for a deep learning algorithm. But because it was a machine learning course, we did explore traditional machine learning algorithms as well. So we learned about how do you extract features from a certain image, and why would certain features in the image play an important role for actually classifying it. So a few things which we worked on towards the bottom left is called HOG, as in a histogram of gradient descriptor for the image, and then using the HOG, the edges, and clustering few portions of the image and then forming it to a feature vector. So machine learning and deep learning do differ in 2 main aspects. Is for machine learning, you've got to create the features from your data yourself, while in deep learning, the algorithm does it for you by itself from looking at the data. So machine learning, you need to handcraft the features, and that's where we realized how messy it can get, especially for image-based problems. And we used a bunch of machine learning techniques, which are called random forest, decision trees, SVMs, with various hyperparameter settings. But like the best which you could get to, even after so many manual features extracted, is like around 80%. And we just used a simple VGG model from our first time just to give it a try, and we got like 94%. And there's where you can see the glaring difference between machine learning and deep learning, at least for image-based activity recognition. So it was a good learning point for us to actually understand how deep learning actually solves this problem. And yeah, I think I can take a sort of a break at this point, and let me ask you in case you've got any questions about the first 2 projects.
Sure. Hi, Rishabh. So I have a question.
Sure.
So you talked about the driver position problem, right?
Yep.
So you said that you've tried both machine learning as well as deep learning techniques. So one thing I would ask is like, when do you like, maybe the problem is very simple and you do not require deep learning as well. So like, what are the ways where you decide you have to go for, say, only basic image processing techniques versus say deep learning technique?
Yep.
Because it might get computationally expensive as well. And
yep.
like one problem that we really encounter in deep learning is that suppose we have got a training set, it may not generalize well for real sequences, right? So maybe how do you deal with this? And like, yeah.
Yep. So I think, yeah, this is a good question in general, and I think like this is the first question we asked ourselves as well. That when you get started with any problem and you are looking for a learning-based approach, do you use machine learning, deep learning, or maybe some other optimization techniques? So I think an important thing over here is to sort of look at the problem domain at first. That's the first thing you should be looking at. So machine learning, personally, in my opinion, because at WPI we've seen data science students and CS students as well who deal with a lot of text data and categorical data, like tabular data. So in general, we've seen machine learning perform like their initial threshold. So your first algorithm is usually a machine learning algorithm. You never start out with a neural network. So even if you are thinking of going into deep learning, you would be first trying out maybe linear regression, or maybe a kernelized version of linear regression where you can introduce some non-linearities. So the first thing is you look at the data. There are pre-processing techniques and visualization techniques where you sort of look at distributions of your data in the input, and then get a feeling that, okay, which are the initial models I could try out. So you could first try out with a bunch of simple machine learning models, which are linear models, see how well your model performs, then transition into non-linear ML models. And from that, you're going to get a clear picture whether you should be even considering deep learning, because machine learning, as we all know, is going to just generalize in the sense it's going to deal with linear sort of distributed data well. And if you can find a non-linear distribution between your data and you can pinpoint it to a certain function. So say maybe you've got f of x is equal to x square. I generate random data points from f of x is equal to x square or y equal to x square. So machine learning does provide flexibility to you. SVMs were like the state of the art back in 2000 and 2010s. And SVM stands for support vector machines. And what basically they did was they could sort of introduce a non-linearity into your problem. So that was called kernel-based SVM, which was very good for solving problems. And that's how you're going to get an idea. So first, you need to look at the data which you're dealing with, what sort of distributions you've got. And if it's going to be an image, so my domain is primarily the images at the moment. Images is usually deep learning off the bat, because machine learning feature extraction for images, you can do it, but even after doing it, you're not even going to get close to the accuracies or even the metrics which a deep learning model would provide. And if you are dealing with tabular data, for example, where you've got like a bunch of features, I think a friend of mine is doing a thesis on related to this, who was actually exploring machine learning models. So given smartphone sensor data, so you've got various sensors in your smartphone, and the IMU, for example, or I'm not really sure with the terminology over there, but you've got like a basic bunch of values, numeric values, like you've got about 20 features. So over there, they do start out with machine learning first. And the state of the art in machine learning is XGBoost and Random Forest. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but yeah, like that is the state of the art in machine learning. For me, primarily working in the image domain, it's been more of deep learning. So
like if you get any problem, you have to think about the data like specifically, and then you have to try out models. Like it depends upon the data, right? So even from my experience for images, like it has been like mostly deep learning. So I can also relate to it, But anyway, I wanted to just ask you a question to get your view on it, So thank you
sure. Even time series data and all, you do have machine learning models on it. But as a CV robotics guy, primarily focused, I've primarily dealt with deep learning. But yeah, machine learning is certainly used for recommendation systems as well, like Amazon and the ones which you see. They are sort of transitioning into RL at the moment, but even YouTube, Netflix, or Amazon recommendations are more machine learning based than you would imagine. Like if you do follow people on LinkedIn, then you'll be surprised to see the number of problems that are actually solved with linear and logistic regression for tabular data in comparison to neural networks. So
maybe like in tabular data, we have the features defined, right? For example, in images, we do not have any features defined.
I think that's the main difference over there. So Any other questions, or should I sort of continue into?
Hello.
Yep, go ahead.
So Bhaiya, my question was like for large data sets, for example, the ones we use in deep learning, I see that machine learning models, especially SVM, involve a lot of computational resources, right? If you see SVM, then they treat landmarks and stuff. So that depends on the data set size. And I've tried many times for using SVMs on these large data sets. So how did you reduce that? Because as you said, you used basic machine learning models like SCMs and stuff. So how did you work on that? Like, if you could give insights.
Okay, so I think like the first part of your question where you actually mentioned SVM models, and many times machine learning models are actually slower than deep learning models for our problem because of the number of features which we are dealing with. So for machine learning, once you handcraft features, and so supposing you have an image and you vectorize it. So vectorize is basically you treat each and every pixel as a feature, which may not be a good idea because you lose sort of spatial information. So if you do that, primarily if you're dealing with machine learning, you're going to be using libraries such as sklearn, scikit-learn. So at the back end, what is happening in scikit-learn, it is not optimized for GPU computations. It's only going to be based on your CPU. So doing computations on your CPU in general for these sort of problems is slower. So many libraries are sort of looking into parallelizing their code more so that they can use the GPU functionality of actually accelerating your training part, which actually deep learning does, and machine learning is not doing at the moment. So for dealing with data, I'll tell you the raw truth. When we did it for our time, we converted the Excel formats into NumPy arrays, and they were pretty big. So like they were in the range of 4 gigabits, 5 gigabits, and then we split our sets that way. And loading that data for sklearn models was very time consuming. So I'm not sure I could help you a lot there, but it was time consuming for us as well. So in deep learning, I can give you a little more insight. Is if you're using libraries like TensorFlow or PyTorch, maybe they have data loader classes with them. So what they do is, if you specify a certain folder, it's going to pick up images from there depending on how much your memory can handle, and then accordingly transform them and then let them pass through the network and then give your output. That's not the case for machine learning. For machine learning in general, it sort of loads your entire data set, which would take how much ever time, trains it, which would take more time as well, and then gives you output. So it's a little bit slower in my opinion as well. Any more questions, or I think I may go overboard like this. Should I continue with the slides, I guess?
Yeah, Rishabh, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So this was, I think this was like one of the most interesting projects I did throughout my master's. So I took up an unconventional course, which like none of my friends took up, and sort of even questioned me many times, like, why did you take up such a weird course? So the course which I took up was, I have been interested in medical imaging in general and applying AI-based stuff, mostly primarily deep learning towards images in the medical domain. So this was sort of my first project over there. So towards the top image, you can see we have a Franka robot, as in the serial robot, which you can see. It's called the Franka robot, and if you look at the end effector closely, I hope you guys know what the end effector means. Can you see my mouse as well?
Yeah, we are able to see it.
Okay.
We do know
Yep.
what I.
Okay, yeah, good. I clarified that. So okay, so this is your robot base. These are like, this is your entire robot arm, which you could call it, and this is the end effector, as in the last part towards the end of your robot. In a serial robot, like the last link on that would be the end effector, which sort of performs an action. So maybe for a manipulator, it would be grasping an object. For our case, we were using an ultrasound probe for actually acquiring ultrasound images, and then you were sending the probe information as well. So what I was doing over here is, you can see this robot, right? So it moves back and forth and gathers ultrasound images. So in case you don't know what ultrasound imaging is, I don't think this would be a really good time for me to sort of explain how ultrasound imaging works. But if you look at the image here at the bottom, this may be a crude ultrasound image before any image pre-processing is performed on it. So what we were trying to do is, given like two ultrasound images, supposing I take an image at this point using the robot, and I take an image at this point. So I have got two distinct points where I've taken images at, and those two images are going to be different. So a problem in general with ultrasound imaging is actually having a 3D view of the entire area which you've scanned. So supposing I scan this area, and I only will get 2D cross sections each and every time I scan. So I'll get one image, one image, one image, one image. But I don't exactly know how can I sort of build a 3D volume using these images. So knowing the probe position, as in the transformation between a probe. So the transformation, I'm not sure if you know about that as well, is like, if I am in this coordinate frame and I want to get into this coordinate frame, what is a matrix I need to multiply this pose with so that I can get this pose? That's what transformation is. So trying to find out the pose using the images was what we were trying to undertake. So the basic problem was, you move this Franka robot around, the end effector is in contact with your surface, which you are actually acquiring the images from. And this is the ultrasound probe. And because this is a robot, you get the ground truth simply because we can get the position over here. We get the position and the orientation of the end effector, and we've got images which are coming in as well. So the input to your network is a bunch of images. You have a pair of images, image 1 and image 2, for example, from here and from here. So you've got image 1 and image 2, and your output would be the relative pose between the two images. So what was the pose of the robot here when it acquired the image, and what is the pose of the robot? Pose of the robot is the XYZ location and orientation. So you need to find out the difference between the two poses using the images. So this was a very interesting problem because this taught me a lot about actually working with a robot, which was my first experience. So we used ROS to actually control the robot. We had a basic force controller written for the robot end effector of 5 Newton, so it's not going to apply force more than 5 Newton on this area. And then once you're capturing these images, so we got to use ROS a lot. We had to plan trajectories to actually capture those images. So you can see over here like how the robot actually moves to capture images. And once you have images and once you have the post data, now the next part is sort of getting into the deep learning aspect. And can you get a model to actually understand that given these two images, what is the difference between the two poses? So I think this was like a very hot project for me in general, because every interview I sort of went into asked me about this project. And one thing in general which sets you apart from the competition in machine learning and deep learning is making your data set and sort of working on it as well. So if most of the machine learning, deep learning guys initially, when they do get started out, you will see them using standard data sets, like any tutorials use MNIST or cats and dogs, or more advanced data sets like dog identification, breed identification, for example, or pedestrian detection, anything. So anywhere where you've already got a data set which publicly exists, the data set is going to be balanced. And what I mean by balanced is that for a how similar your test and train distributions are. So if I have 10 classes and I've got 10 images for each class, that's called a balanced data set, because probably even without training a model, 10% chances are that if you randomly say that this image belongs to class 2, it's got a 10% chance of being true. So you want the probability distribution for your data to be sort of not biased. But when you make your own data set, you understand a lot of different problems which you wouldn't actually see if you're only just training a network. So now the variable in the problem is actually acquiring better data and training a network. So it introduces another modality. And this was very interesting. This was my course project for medical imaging and instrumentation as well. And this was sort of messed up in one sense, because this is the actual time when COVID hit. So for the first part of the semester, I went and acquired data from the lab. And the second part of the semester, labs were shut down. So I sort of had to maximize the use of the data I already had. So in any case, I was able to get decent results and we were pretty happy. So this was a very interesting problem which I worked on. And a lot of interviewers asked me about this, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? How did you do this? So doing anything novel in the sense of actually getting your own data set is something which really does put you apart in that sense. Oops. So yeah, I think this is going to get a little too complex, so I'll just sort of go through it, give you an overview. So this was a deep learning course project. I took up deep learning in spring 2020, and it was like one of the best courses I've taken up at WPI. The professor was amazing and we learned a lot. And I did a really advanced project which I never thought I could even sort of have the capacity to do. So we took on a way more challenging. We've been only dealing with classification problems till now, simple regression problems. We went straight away headfirst into 3D object detection, not having any idea what this is. So 3D object detection is still one of the active research areas, even in self-driving cars and robotics in general. And it's a very complex problem. So if you think that a single deep neural network is complicated, this was dealing with like 3 or 4 deep neural networks in succession parallelly as your whole architecture. So that's how complicated it was. So it was basically using a 2D detection initially in the image. So if you can see towards the right on the image over here, you have a 2D detection. You've seen a car, you've detected a 2D. From the 2D image, you've detected the car, and you have the point cloud as well. So point cloud is the 3D representation of the environment around you. So what you're going to do is you're going to project this 2D region of interest into 3D in the form of a frustum, and then sort of try to localize this 3D object of interest. And I think this is all I'm going to tell you, because it's already, I guess it's getting a little confusing if you're not familiar with the deep learning lingo. So, but this was very interesting, and this was one of the hardest projects we undertook as well. And like these were the results which we got. I can show you, like the red bounding box is the ground truth of a car. That's what I think is from the 3D scan. And in case you can see the orangish bounding box, that is the one which our model predicted. So we did pretty poor in comparison to what we were expecting it to do, but we learned a lot in this project. Like the actual complexities of dealing with transition from 2D to 3D are enormous. Don't underestimate it. So I think this is my current sorry, I can stop sharing.
No. Please do share the slides. I just have a small question in that.
Yep, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So out there, what were the sensory modalities that were in use?
For which project? Sorry, I didn't get you.
The 3D object detection.
The 3D object, this was the KT dataset. So on KT dataset, you've got the camera information, you've got like two cameras, you've got a left image and a right image. So you have stereo information, you've got camera information, and they've got a LiDAR mounted on the roof as well, a Velodyne LiDAR. So you have point clouds coming in. So a multimodal fusion approach was the one which we used, and it was based on the camera plus your LiDAR information. So I can give you like, I think the diagram was pretty explanatory in the sense of what we were doing. You find a 2D region of interest from the image and you sort of extend it towards the 3D domain and sort of try to find the object in the 3D domain.
Okay.
It sounds pretty easy, but no, it's still one of the hottest area of it. Yep, go ahead.
One question here, Rishabh. So, how did you exactly like transfer from the 2D to 3D thing? So, so I have actually worked on a very similar project. So, like in my project, what we did was like first of all we get the 2D detection, and then we use like basically we detect the, for example, the car across two scenes, and then use something called as the bundle adjustment to like get to the 3D points.
Okay. Yeah, I think
so,
what
yeah,
you're talking about is a little bit of more of the
How did you do it
traditional
exactly?
computer vision
Maybe just
based
very
approaches. Sure. Yeah, sure. So what I was saying is exactly is in the KT dataset, you're giving all the calibration data. So you know the transformations between your camera and your LiDAR, and you know the transformations between one camera and another camera as well. So now the exact information which you have with you. So for example, I decide, okay, only I'm going to look at the left camera. So in my left camera image, I'm going to detect a 2D object. I have a 2D detector which was fast RCNN in their case. We used a different 2D detector which was our project. So you've detected a 2D region of interest. So now using the camera calibration and the LiDAR calibration parameters, you can project your LiDAR into the camera frame of reference. So what happens in that case is LiDAR gives you sparse information. So yep, knowing the calibration simplifies the whole process. So LiDAR gives you sparse information. So what I mean by sparse information is if you look at an image, you can see each and every pixel in the image unless you've got sort of noise. You can visually identify pixel in the image and you can write a program easily to extract information.
Yeah.
But if you go into 3D domain with a LiDAR splits beams. I'm not very familiar with the internal workings of a LiDAR as well, but you don't have information for each and every 3D point in the scene. You're going to have information for many points, but not all points. So you're going to project that LiDAR into your scene using the calibration and then go into the 3D domain. So I think that sort of is the answer to your question, that using the calibration, you project the 3D LiDAR into your 2D domain, and then you move ahead with actually finding the 3D region of interest. So sorry if it went a little bit over, but I got a little excited, but yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I think basically, no worries, I think it was
losing Pratyush, I think, yeah.
And so yeah, thank you for it.
Okay, no worries. Do you want me to continue with? I think I got only two or three slides more. I'm almost done. So, any more questions, or do you want me to continue?
Yeah. Let's have it at the end, Rishabh. So let's finish it off.
Okay, sure. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, this is like my current project and research. So I'm currently working on robotic manipulation and specifically in robotic grasping based on deep learning. So the problem statement over here is not that complicated. So given an image and depth information for an object of interest, you need to find the optimum grasping points so that your parallel plate gripper can easily go and pick up that object. So I think this sounds deceivingly simple, and it's still an unsolved problem in robotic manipulation. It's getting towards being solved for all cases, but in general, I think manipulation is like one of the hottest areas of research in robotics at the moment, because with the breakthrough which deep learning has provided on the computer vision aspects, manipulation has sort of used deep learning based solutions to actually work on their vision part of the pipeline. So what we're going to do over here is towards the top, you can see the images clearly. I think the right image is the best explanation over here. You've got an image of a hammer, and what I'm going to be dealing with is depth data as well. So we have a Kinect sensor. So what you want to do is, given this image, this is the prediction you need to make, like the green box in case you hopefully can see it. So you need to predict a rectangle given that image, which would be the ideal rectangle for actually grasping that object. So it sounds pretty simple, and the complications actually arrive with in many stages over here. So the first thing is even segmenting out an object of interest in a particular scene. So if I have an object on a table and segmenting it out on the table is going to be difficult. So people couldn't do it in the past without deep learning, and now deep learning has come in and sort of simplified that part of the problem. And the other part it is simplifying as well is that given this object, can I predict this rectangle? So I'm using a multimodal fusion based approach. I did hear Lokesh, I think, talking about multimodal inputs. So this is another new area in deep learning as well, where you're dealing with inputs from multiple modalities. So I'm dealing with RGB information, which is similar, and you're dealing with depth information, which is not exactly similar to RGB information. So how do you use two different information sources to actually perform a prediction in our case? So you'll be having the RGB and depth map for this image, and you'll be using a deep neural network to predict this grasp. This is the most simplified version I can give you at the moment. And we are looking into a few data sets, and we'll be looking to perform real robot experiments as well. So this is my current research, which I'm doing in my last semester. So it's still in progress, but yeah, I can answer any questions. I've done my literature survey, and so I'm pretty sure what I'll be doing. So this is, and I think this is one interesting aspect as well. I'm not sure how much I can share about this, but yeah, I remember you people being excited about the NASA Space Robotics Challenge. So yeah, WP, I did take part of it, and I was in the vision team primarily, and it was a pretty interesting problem statement. So you are on the moon, as in you have a raw simulation based in Gazebo, where you have the lunar surface sort of simulated with various the surface, the terrain is not flat. So towards the right, you can see in the image clearly that you don't have a flat terrain. You have craters, rocks. And now what you've got to do is you've got three robots. The three of them are called the Scout, the Excavator, and the Hauler. And you've got to detect resources on the surface of the moon. You don't know the location to those resources, obviously. So your Scout robot is sort of needs to go around the surface of the moon, look around for the resources of interest. Then once it finds the resource of interest, it needs to send a signal to the excavator and the hauler to actually go out and dig those resources. So the excavator is a mobile robot with an arm attached to it. So it can go to a certain position and dig over there. So you need to write the code to actually do that as well, like the forward, inverse kinematics and digging the portion. So what you're going to do is the Scout sends the position of the volatile, which is the resource. The excavator goes to that position, digs up that resource, gives it to the hauler. The hauler is like a dump truck where you just put stuff in, like the construction trucks you see. And then that hauler is supposed to return to a place called the processing plant, which towards the right you can see an image over here. So this was like the main task in the NASA Space Robotics Challenge, where you needed to localize that resource of interest, send information to your other robots to actually come to that particular location, pick up that resource and go back. So it seems pretty easy, as in from the first sight that it might not be that difficult, but it was very challenging. Like many people worked on it and we sort of made it together. So I in particular was part of the vision team, like I've spoken to you about deep learning. So I worked on 2D object detection, where we were actually finding the processing plant and rocks, craters, and there were other objects of interest in the simulation. So I trained a model to actually, we gathered data ourselves from the simulation. We trained a model to actually find our objects of interest. And then the perception team was basically dealing with two components, the SLAM part and the object detection part. So I worked on object detection in particular, and the SLAM part was localizing your robot on the moon. So your sensor readings are very noisy. You can't be sure that if you travel from, supposing A to B, because you don't have any other information like GPS maybe, which would help you localize your position. So SLAM in general is like, how do I know for sure where I am in a map and that the map is correct around me? So sending information, actually going to that particular position and being sure that, okay, this is the position I am at, and then sending information for other robots to come to get you and then navigate through this terrain while obviously avoiding obstacles and coming back to the processing plant was the task. So I can take more questions about NASA. I'm not sure I have more pictures to show you, but sure you can ask me. And I can wrap up with my NVIDIA internship experience in particular. I was a member of the Jetson team, And I'm not sure if you heard about the Jetson platform. It's similar to Arduino, I guess, but you have a GPU with it. So it's primarily towards AI and deep learning for robots in general. It's a small device which you can attach to maybe a robotic arm or a mobile robot. And as you already know that I was responsible for developing deep learning based packages for ROS2. So the industry is making a switch from ROS1 to ROS2, and I was working on developing packages related to accelerated inference on embedded platforms for object detection and classification using ROS2 as well. And I met a lot of smart people there. As in, you'll be blown away. If you love to learn more things, I think these companies provide you with the opportunity to actually learn a lot more, even outside your domain of interest. And they're very helpful. So it's very fun working with them. And the second part of my project, which I guess I can tell you a little bit about, is I got to work on a concept called Sim to Real, where you use synthetic data for training a neural network. So you don't have access to real data. So maybe you start a simulation with PyBullet or Gazebo, if you know about it. So you start a simulation with any simulation software you know, and you gather data from that simulation software, but you deploy the model which you trained on a real robot in the real world. So that's called Sim to Real, which is going to be the future in deep learning as well. So that was my work at NVIDIA. And yep, I think I'm done with my slides over here. So I can take any questions which you guys may still have.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rishabh. So there was quite a lot of projects, and we got to.
Yep, sorry for going overboard. I think like I had 30 minutes, but taking questions in here and there sort of took a little bit of more.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, so the thing
yeah.
is,
Sorry,
we
go
would to kind of showcase like what projects we would have seen the website, but apart from it, I'd like to add on. So your current project on the GRASP, right? So the 2D grasping. So we also recently participated. The team Roborec participated in a national level event from Flipkart. So we had this exact PS of intelligent picking. So in a warehouse situation, we need to displace 25 objects. And this was done, we should have end-to-end autonomy. So you just click a button and then switch off a button. That's it. So this was a thing. And then we actually did the exact same thing. It was like you were reading out of a report. So the parallel graphing and the iris grabbing, and then we did this thing and we went a step ahead. But of course, our results are limited to PyBullet simulation. But what we did is instead of relying on Kinect data, we did depth estimation as well to cut down the cost. So we just took the RGB images and then we were able to, I think if Ayush is there, he can just brief a little bit about our work. So Ayush, are you there? Yeah, just give a slight brief for our work so that just, you know, it's really interesting to talk about things that both of our teams have worked. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we also had the same PS, and in the just like object detection was done initially to like detect the objects lying on the table, and then you take a closer image of each one of them. And yeah, initially we were using depth data from PyBullet, but ultimately to cut down the cost of a depth camera, we did that also using deep learning, and like we did depth estimation, and together with those two images, we you might have read a paper about GR-ConvNet. Yeah, so we manipulated, like we did a bit of tweaks in that, and we trained that model for our PS, and yeah, we used that for, and our grabber also had like a suction cup attached to it, and we did like parallel plate grasping as well as suction, combination of the two, because to handle the diversity of the objects like in the warehouse.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Like how did you do the depth estimation part?
The depth estimation was basically we used a ready-made model for depth estimation.
Okay. But
Yeah.
was it like monocular depth estimation, like only a single camera?
Yeah.
Interesting. That's another hot area of research as well in general. Monocular depth test. Only using a single camera, how do you find out depth? Yep, really interesting, man. It's nice to see like you've sort of formulated the whole problem and figured out the pieces which you need to put in, and then have the solution. And
Yes.
that's really good.
Actually, relating to the later work, so we did all this in simulation. Of course, things work beautifully in simulation. So then we went about domain randomization, domain adaptation,
Yep.
you know, getting things running. So that's the phase where we are currently. So yeah, now let me just open the thing to questions. So guys, any question at all? I think we are already like, yeah, we had enough questions in between, but still.
Yeah, you can go ahead. I'm free. I have no issues with any questions.
One question.
Yep.
Yeah, so I would like to have I would like to have your insight on the sim to real part you talked about.
Mhm.
So like majorly because of COVID or something, like we are working in simulation, right? But we know it's tough to transfer the same performance to the real thing. Even for NASA Space Robotics Challenge, I think it's completely simulation as of now. Or have you
Yep.
guys done some
NASA
testing
Space
of real
Robotics
robots?
is completely simulation based. So we sort of acquire data in the simulation, we train a model, and we are even classifying in simulation as in performing inference in simulation. But I think your question on sim to real is pretty interesting in general.
Okay.
That's another hot topic of research in general for deep reinforcement learning and deep learning as well. Like I think the first step over here is sort of having a reliable simulation. So at least I've used Gazebo as a roboticist myself. So Gazebo provides with you only limited flexibility to actually come up with good simulation models for robotics in particular. So one thing when you are actually training a model, say for example, I'm just simply training a model for detecting maybe an object. So I'm training my model in simulation for detecting maybe you are coming up with an object of interest, supposing a chips packet. I don't know, like anything which comes to your mind, any random object. So the things, at least from initial
Yeah.
point of view, when you're dealing with sim2real, you need to gather data yourself. Gathering data yourself is one pain. So because like I told you, dealing with both parts of the problem now, your
Yeah.
data acquisition plus training the
Yeah.
model. So if things go wrong, you need to know which one was the reason. So data acquisition in general, you want your model to generalize well, right? From simulation to reality, because
Yeah.
there's already a bridge between the two of them. If you have, for example, a banana in simulation and banana in reality, both the images are going to look different. You have no
Yeah.
doubt about that. But the advantage which you can take of deep neural networks in that sense is that the features which the neural networks
Yeah.
learn, even from simulation or from reality, should be transferable, even though that maybe the problem is not exactly the same. So if your so in
Okay.
sim2real, you'll have various components coming in, like the texture of your object, the color, the background, the orientations. So you've got to make sure that you have a data set which is entirely distributed across all these spectrums. So that will deal with your data part. Like how do you have a data which is distributed well? And you want to make sure,
Yeah.
and now this is the sort of question mark part. Like, is your simulation actually that good? Like if I say that I want to import a chips packet into a simulation, or maybe a cup, yeah, how accurate
Yeah.
of a
Is it
cup is
reliable?
that versus the real world? So that is the first question which you need to answer, and that is the answer which still the industry is looking for. Like, can you come up with a very good simulation environment which can be transferred to the real world? Because I think the second part of the problem is still a little solved, where if you have a very good simulation, can you transfer it to the real world? The answer is, it seems so at the moment. Yes, you can do it. But getting that good simulation environment set up, like for iBullet, or
Okay.
like even like
Okay.
I'd say, at least for ARC is Gazebo, even a NASA Space Robotics Challenges is in Gazebo. So it's not that good. As in, you won't find real world examples you can actually get into the simulation which are transferable. So the main issue is the simulation at the moment, getting a good simulation setup. So not sure I answered your question, but like those are my thoughts about it.
Actually, one more question. I know we are completely
Sure.
over, but I would like take the chance. So for the NASA Space Robotics Challenge, like use deep learning, right? So but
Yep.
like for using GPUs in space, we require them to be radiation hardened, right? But they are fundamentally not radiation hardened as of now, as per like my knowledge. So
Yep.
like how do you tackle
Yeah,
this
I think
problem?
I think this is an interesting avenue which was not relevant to us at all. Like NASA gave us a Docker. Okay, you run this Docker and you have this simulation. You don't need to worry about if this is going to work in space or not. But what you say in general poses to be a good question.
Okay.
So yeah, I can give you a perspective on the answer for that as well. So nowadays, the focus on deep learning as well, even on my internship experience, was deployment rather than training. So the training part is probably
Okay.
going to be handled by guys who've got a lot of experience, or maybe probably a PhD as well, who've done a lot of training throughout their lives, because there are people who do that for a living.
Yeah.
So your problem more mainly is going to be
Yeah.
sort of getting that model into a deployment stage. Like, how can I use this model in the real world? And there is a gap between those two as well. So if you look at deep learning based models, so let's take, for example, I'm sure you may have heard of ResNet or AlexNet, which were like the prominent classification architectures. The model size for those
Yep.
prominent models for ResNet is like more than 500 megabyte, and for AlexNet it was 250 MB. So the first question is, how do you get such a big
Yeah.
model onto an embedded system where you've got 10 MB or 20 MB restraints in computation? So that's a hot area of research as well, like
Exactly.
model compression and quantization, inference optimization. So given a model, how do you deploy it on smaller systems which can actually make use of it? So that was something I worked on in my internship as well. And you would be surprised to hear, so the model which we're currently using on in NASA for object detection is less than 10 MB, 10 megabytes of memory. We are having multiple million parameters in a
Oh,
model,
is it?
and you're having only 10 megabytes of memory. So those 10 megabytes of memory, so if you say that you don't have a GPU working in space, okay, at the moment, true, but I can run that on a CPU and still get almost a real-time FPS. So I'll be good anyway. So
Yeah.
a CPU can still work, and I can
So basically
do
optimizing
my
the model.
inference.
Okay.
Yep, it's very important.
Okay.
Compressing and optimizing a model is a very important aspect when you deploy in the real world. So yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I recently came across a very interesting use case. In space, they use like the embedded system, like which is able to like basically which are used in our phones. That's what I actually came to.
I think we sort of lost
It was very
half
surprising.
your audio there. I couldn't sort of understand you. Sorry.
Yeah, but yeah.
Maybe we can chat about it later. I think we're going overboard.
Yeah, hello Rishabh, this is Niran. I just have a small question about the master's application.
Sorry, Nilan, go ahead.
Yeah, so like, can you just brief us like what are this thesis and non-thesis master? So what are the differences you have to keep in mind while applying for both of them?
Yeah, sure. I think that's an important question. I think I sort of forgot about it, but yeah, that's a really good question. So personally, I think going for thesis or non-thesis is really like two different aspects in general. If you are thinking of pursuing a PhD, I would strongly recommend you to consider the thesis option, and don't be lost in case you sort of want to take up a lot of courses, because robotics is so broad and there's a lot of research going on in so many domains, and it's okay to be confused. So if you want to take up, say for example, reinforcement learning, deep learning, or maybe human robot interaction, which may not be that related, but you're just curious to learn about it, then go for that as well. Because for transitioning into a PhD, having good research experience is necessary. So that can be through two ways. So either you work as a research assistant in a lab and you sort of try and get your work published in case you can't do a thesis. A thesis would be your top priority to sort of put your level into PhD, because that transition would be simpler even when you have interviews with, for example, advisors or anyone, that you have a lot to say about your thesis. And the main reason why you would be called for an interview for a PhD position is because of your thesis. But the other compensation for that is having publications related to your area of interest by working in a research lab at the university or anyway. So in that case, going for a thesis does make sense and try for a publication. But if you're not sure and you are going to look for a job primarily after your master's, then going the breadth approach would make a little bit more sense, because you would get to cover a lot of coursework and different skill sets. You never know which employees sort of look for. So like, I'm personally auditing a course called Swarm Intelligence, which very few people take up in robotics as well, because it's a pretty narrow domain. So you're not sure if it's going to be relevant from an industrial point of view. But there are certain companies who particularly look only for that component when you're selecting a candidate. So if you are confused about a thesis, do try research at least in labs at master's level, because it's a different experience. Certainly try research in labs, irrespective of thesis or not. So you may get a publication or you may just do project, that's okay. If you want to do a PhD, strongly consider thesis. If you're looking for a job, lab plus non-thesis credit work is the best, which I would suggest. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's clear now. Thank you.
Okay. I can give you like one more point in terms of WPI. For doing a thesis, you need 9 credits. Whereas for doing a non-thesis approach, you need only 3 credits of research. So you get 6 credits more to take up interesting coursework, whichever you may find relevant. So you can use those 6 credits that way. Otherwise, you can go for 9 credits research. And the most important thing for research, which I hope I should not be needing to tell you, but select a good professor and lab. So you don't want to be stuck there. It does happen here as well, taking up professors who sort of just joined, or maybe professors who are already on tenure track. Tenure track is basically when their job is guaranteed. So nothing is going to happen to them, irrespective if the PhD students perform or whatever happens in the lab. So they get lax, they'll get loose, they don't care a lot. So try to find that faculty who's sort of transitioning into getting to that tenure track, so that he's going to push you to do research well. So that would be nice. But yeah, find good faculty members to do research. It's going to be important.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So any other question, guys? More like an interaction. Okay.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah, Raghav.
I'm
Introduce.
Raghav. Yeah. So you told in the beginning that you had 15 grades for the robotics core work, and in the extra 9 grades that you were having, you did your deep learning
By
and
the way,
research
Rishabh,
courses.
Yep,
like
we're losing
Yeah,
Pratyush. I
Pratyush,
think.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think there is some network issue. So yeah, can you just put it in?
no.
Yeah, Pratyush, maybe you could just put it in the chat. Yeah, sorry, Raghav. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, sorry,
Yeah, Raghav,
Raghav,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying, you had 15 grades for your robotics core work, and you are interested in vision and perception and deep learning stuff. So you did it
Yep.
from the CSE department in your extra 9 grades. So what
Yep.
were the constituents of your main robotics core work that constituted that 15 grades of yours? The courses and the stuff that you did.
Okay, sure. So for main, yeah, I can describe my courses throughout all my semesters. My choice of courses has been eccentric in comparison to my batchmates. I've taken up a bunch of courses which like none of my friends were in, so I was sort of alone there. But okay. So the first I have mandatory robot control, robot dynamics, and foundation of robotics for all robotics students. This is something you have to do throughout your 2 years. You can do it anytime, but usually in the first semester, students take up foundation of robotics and dynamics, and then in the second semester, controls. So I sort of rejected this approach. I took up dynamics in the first semester. I took up computer vision and machine learning. Out of this, machine learning was outside my department. It was offered by CSE. So these were the 3 courses I took up in my first semester. In my second semester, I took up advanced robot navigation, which was an RB course. I took up medical imaging and instrumentation, the ultrasound project, which I just discussed with you guys. And I took up deep learning. Deep learning was outside robotics, and the remaining 2 were again robotics courses. Then during my summer, I took up robot controls, which is mandatory again. And then interestingly, during my fall semester, I managed to get my foundations of robotics waived. So I could take 3 credits instead of that. And that's where I took up robotic manipulation. So that was my last semester, and we took up a business course as well. And in my final semester, I'm doing a 3 credits research on robotic manipulation. So that's how I've split my 30 credits. So everything which I described was 3 credits. So I have like total 5 credits research towards my master's. 3 is mandatory. 5 is like if you want to do it, do it. 3 is mandatory, 9 is thesis, and anything in between is like up to you. And the remaining coursework flexibility, as long as you have 15 credits in RB, you are